How could a man kill, lie, and hide for nearly half a century without anyone suspecting? For decades, families lived with unanswered questions while he blended into ordinary life. But one small breakthrough would finally unravel the truth he thought was buried forever. This is the story of John Arthur Getreu, a predator who walked free for 45 years after leaving 2 young women dead near Stanford University. His crimes were brutal, his trail went cold, and justice seemed impossible. But a single careless mistake brought his past crashing back. In this video, we'll take you inside the decades-long investigation, the shocking courtroom moments, and the chilling secrets that only came to light at the very end. Before we dive in, hit like if stories like this fascinate you, and drop a comment with your first reaction to this case. I'd love to hear your thoughts. September 22nd, 2023. Inside the cold, sterile walls of the California healthcare facility in Stockton, an old man lay dying. His once strong frame was frail, worn down by time and illness. Guards passed by without ceremony. To them, he was just another inmate taking his final breath. But to the world outside those prison walls, this was no ordinary prisoner. The man was John Arthur Getreu, a name that once struck fear in the Bay Area, a name whispered in connection to brutal crimes that haunted families for decades. At 79 years old, Getreu's death marked the end of a story spanning nearly 6 decades, a story drenched in blood, betrayal, and secrets buried under layers of lies. For years, he had lived a double life: husband, father, community leader by day, predator, rapist, and killer by night. And though justice had finally caught up with him in his final years, it came too late for the lives he shattered. To some, his death was a moment of closure. To others, it was far too merciful an ending for a man who had stolen so much. The end of John Getreu was not a tragedy. It was the final breath of a monster. It was June 8th, 1963, in Bad Kreuznach, West Germany, a quiet town where American military families lived under the shadow of the Cold War. That evening, the local American high school held its graduation dance. Music blared, teenagers laughed, and the night promised nothing but celebration. Among them was 15-year-old Margaret Williams, the bright daughter of an army chaplain. She was innocent, trusting, and excited for the night ahead. Watching her from across the room was 18-year-old John Arthur Getreu, a senior on the brink of adulthood. Outwardly, he was just another military kid, but behind his calm eyes brewed something far more sinister. After the dance, John offered to walk Margaret home. Instead, he led her to the darkened baseball field, far from the safety of the crowd. There, he revealed his true nature. Margaret was assaulted, beaten, and left with devastating head injuries. Hours later, she was found unconscious, and soon after, she was gone. The community was horrified. Witnesses placed Getreu with Margaret that night, making him the prime suspect. Though he denied it, the evidence was undeniable. In 1964, a German court convicted him of murder, but his 10-year sentence and early release meant the world had not seen the last of him. When John Arthur Getreu was released from a German prison after serving just over 6 years, the world seemed ready to forget. He was deported back to the United States, a free man in his early 20s. To those around him, he appeared to be starting fresh, building the image of an ordinary husband, neighbor, and worker. In Reno, Nevada, he married a woman named Susan. Soon after, they moved to Palo Alto, California, a thriving community in the heart of Silicon Valley. He worked odd jobs: security guard, carpenter, even a hospital technician. Nothing about him seemed remarkable. And that was the point. He blended in. Getreu even positioned himself as a man of trust, becoming a Boy Scout counselor, leading trips and mentoring teenagers. To parents, he was the kind of adult you could rely on to keep your children safe. But beneath the surface, his violent urges had not disappeared. By 1975, the mask cracked. He was accused of sexually abusing a 17-year-old explorer scout. Though the charges led to only a short jail sentence and probation, the revelation shattered his marriage. Susan divorced him. Yet despite the warning signs, John slipped back into society, quiet, polite, and hiding a darkness that was far from gone. The early 1970s brought prosperity to Palo Alto, a community brimming with college students, young professionals, and the promise of the future. But for two young women near Stanford University, those years would end in tragedy at the hands of a man no one suspected. On February 13, 1973, Leslie Marie Perlov, a 21-year-old Stanford graduate and legal secretary, left work and never came home. 3 days later, her body was discovered along the Stanford Dish hiking trail. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own floral scarf. The brutality shocked investigators. Leslie had fought hard. DNA from under her fingernails captured the struggle of her final moments. Just over a year later, on March 24, 1974, another young woman vanished. Janet Ann Taylor, also 21, was last seen hitchhiking near campus. The next day, her body was found in a ditch off Sand Hill Road, raped and strangled. She was the daughter of famed Stanford coach Chuck Taylor, aim that only deepened the horror for the community. Police searched for answers, but with no solid leads, the cases grew cold. The killer walked free, blending back into everyday life, while two promising lives were gone forever. After the murders of Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor, investigators were desperate for a suspect, but John Arthur Getreu seemed invisible, hiding in plain sight. By day, he worked odd jobs: security guard, carpenter, hospital technician. By night, he wore the mask of respectability, a husband, a stepfather, even a Boy Scout counselor trusted to guide and protect children. But beneath this carefully crafted facade lurked something far darker. In 1975, Getreu's mask slipped when he was charged with sexually abusing a 17-year-old girl in his Explorer Scout troop. The court gave him little more than a slap on the wrist, 6 months in jail, most of it suspended, and probation. His wife divorced him, citing abuse that had long been hidden behind closed doors. Yet despite these warning signs, no one connected him to the unsolved Stanford murders. He left California for a time, remarried, raised children, and moved through communities like a shadow, charming neighbors, earning trust, and slipping past suspicion. What no one knew was chilling. The same man shaking hands at scout meetings and serving at fraternal lodges was the very predator who had strangled two young women to death. The mask was working. For decades, the murders of Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor sat in dusty case files, cold, silent, unsolved. Detectives had no fingerprints, no credible suspects, and no way to identify the mysterious killer who had terrorized Stanford's quiet hills in the 1970s. But then, in the late 2010s, science finally caught up with him. The revolution in DNA technology and genetic genealogy opened doors investigators never thought possible. The evidence collected from Leslie's body in 1973, the scarf around her neck, the DNA under her fingernails, was re-examined with state-of-the-art tools. The result? A genetic profile of the killer himself. Investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, where genetic genealogist C.C. Moore used family tree mapping to trace the unknown DNA back through generations. Slowly, like assembling a puzzle, one name emerged again and again: John Arthur Getreu. To be sure, detectives needed direct confirmation. They followed him quietly, waiting for a mistake. One day, Getreu tossed away a used coffee cup. That discarded item carried his DNA, and it was a perfect match to the samples from the 1970s murders. After nearly half a century of hiding, the predator in the shadows had finally been unmasked. On November 20th, 2018, police knocked on the door of a quiet suburban home in Hayward, California. Behind it stood a frail, elderly man with glasses, John Arthur Getreu. To his neighbors, he was friendly, ordinary, unremarkable. But in the interrogation room, the mask began to slip. Detective Sergeant Cortez leaned forward, asking about his past. Getreu calmly spoke of growing up in Ohio, of moving overseas with his army father. He claimed he had lived a normal life, never in trouble with the law. But when pressed, his story cracked. Almost casually, he admitted, "I killed a chaplain's daughter back in Germany." The words hung in the air, cold, matter of fact. As detectives shifted toward the Stanford murders, Getreu denied everything. He said he'd never seen the victims, never walked those trails, never hurt anyone. Yet he seemed to know details he shouldn't, slipping up when he called Leslie Perlov a Stanford graduate before detectives ever mentioned it. When told his DNA was on the bodies, Getreu grew defensive, rambling about how DNA could transfer in strange ways. But then, another slip. He muttered about 2 girls. Even though only one murder had been mentioned aloud, the walls were closing in. By 2021, nearly half a century after the murders, John Arthur Getreu was finally forced to face justice. His trial for the murder of Janet Taylor opened in a San Mateo County courtroom, drawing the eyes of a community still haunted by her death. The daughter of a Stanford football coach, Janet had been just 21 when her life was stolen. For 3 long weeks, the courtroom heard chilling details. DNA evidence from Janet's torn clothing left little room for doubt. Prosecutors painted Getreu as a predator who prowled the shadows for decades, hiding behind marriages, jobs, and a polished suburban life. The defense tried to cast uncertainty, but the science was undeniable. In September 2021, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole, but justice wasn't done. In 2023, weakened by illness, Getreu faced trial for the murder of Leslie Perlov. Too frail to appear in person, he attended by video from a hospital bed. This time, he admitted the truth. He had strangled Leslie after she resisted his assault. Another life sentence was added. 2 young women gone. 2 families scarred forever. 1 killer finally unmasked. Even after 2 murder convictions, investigators were haunted by a lingering question. How many more victims were there? Journalists and detectives alike suspected that John Arthur Getreu's crime stretched far beyond the cases of Janet Taylor and Leslie Perlov. Investigative reporter Grace Kang was among the most vocal, convinced that Getreu had left a trail of blood spanning decades and states. She noted that there were at least a dozen unsolved murders in California and Ohio that bore his signature. Young women, sudden disappearances, brutal strangulation. One chilling account came from Sharon Luquez, who alleged that Getreu tried to kill her back in 1969. She escaped, but her story hinted at a violent pattern that had gone unchecked for years. In Ohio, authorities began re-examining the 1980 murder of 15-year-old Teresa Smith, found dead in her Newark home. The details were eerily familiar, suggesting Getreu's hand at work. Though never formally charged, investigators continued comparing his DNA to evidence from unsolved cases. His own son reportedly cooperated with detectives, determined to uncover the truth about his father's hidden past. The unanswered question still hangs in the air. Was Getreu a serial killer with only 3 known victims, or many more lost to the shadow? On September 22, 2023, inside the stark walls of the California healthcare facility in Stockton, John Arthur Getreu took his final breath. At 79 years old, the man who had evaded justice for decades died of natural causes while serving 2 life sentences. His death was quiet, unremarkable, nothing like the chaos and horror he once inflicted on his victim. For some, his passing was a moment of relief. Good, said Santa Clara County District Attorney Jeff Rosen, a single word that carried the weight of justice finally delivered. Families of victims expressed a measure of peace, grateful that Getreu had lived long enough to face trial and be publicly named for what he was. But for others, the ending felt hollow. The unanswered questions remained. How many women had truly fallen prey to his violence? How many families still wait for closure that will never come? Investigators continue to search, running his DNA against evidence from cold cases, hoping, even after his death, to uncover the full extent of his crimes. In the end, Getreu's story is a chilling reminder. Time does not erase evil. And sometimes, even when a monster dies, the shadows he leaves behind never fade. If this case gripped you, hit like to help more people discover it. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling stories where justice finally finds its way.